The last time I taught this class, students said they had a little trouble understanding what biosphere reserves were. And so I thought I'd do a quick video and tell you a little bit about biosphere reserves. They're considered learning places for sustainable development. And they're managed by UNESCO. UNESCO is the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. And UNESCO has a Man in the Biosphere program. And that Man in the Biosphere program contributes to the achievement of Sustainable Development Goals defined in Agenda 2030, which was adopted by the United Nations General Assembly in 2015. The Man in the Biosphere program has goals, and they are to develop and strengthen models of sustainable development through the world network of biosphere reserves. And then what they learn from those reserves, one of the jobs of the Man in the Biosphere program is to communicate experience and lessons learned from those reserves and facilitate the global diffusion and application of these models to other regions. An area has to meet certain criteria to be nominated for status as a UNESCO Biosphere Reserves. And remember, this is a worldwide system of reserves. The site has to have some significance for biodiversity conservation. It must represent a unique ecological region, and it should be large enough to demonstrate approaches for sustainable development on a regional scale. And so these reserves are a coordinated global network of protected areas to create a global network of areas for scientific research and monitoring. And so biosphere reserves should include representative samples of the world's ecosystems with an emphasis on integrating conservation and development. And so within the reserve, sustainable resource use and development is studied, so the reserve can become a model for rural development compatible with conservation. And so the Man in the Biosphere program provides logistical support for research, monitoring, education, training, and information exchange. And so there are 3 zones in a reserve. This is a conceptual layout of a biosphere reserve. This is the same one you had in your reading. And so the reserve has 3 zones. You can see a core. Here's another core area here. And the core area is surrounded by the buffer zone. And that buffer zone is the limit of legal protection. And so the core zone and the buffer zone are legally protected. And then extending from that is a transition zone or a zone of cooperation where things that are learned inside the reserve are then passed on to local people in a model for sustainable development. And so anyway, let's talk specifically about the 3 zones. The core zone that you see here and here provides legal protection for natural or minimally disturbed ecosystems. And very few activities can take place in the core. You cannot do manipulative research. However, it provides opportunities for ecological monitoring. And so you could have a weather station there. You could measure CO2 levels. You could do plant transects to see how climate change is affecting vegetational changes, but no manipulative research. Okay. And so that core zone functions as a reference point for the natural state of ecosystems represented by the particular biosphere reserve. So then, surrounding this core zone is the buffer zone that you see in a solid line here. And the buffer zone surrounds the core zone to protect it from outside land use pressures. They do allow experimental research in the buffer zone. Educational activities can take place in the buffer zone. Public recreation or ecotourism can take place in the buffer zone, and other economic activities can also take place. If it was a marine biosphere reserve, they could do fishing, sustainable fishing practices and things like that. And so you can see traditional land uses, again, ecological monitoring. And again, that solid line represents legal protection. And so the buffer zone is the outermost limit of legal protection for the Biosphere Reserve. And then finally, the transition zone. The transition zone is not legally protected, and that's represented by the dotted line here. And conservation is pursued through cooperation with the local people. And so the local people pursue sustainable farming practices, sustainable fishing, sustainable forestry, and other economic activities that are compatible with sustainable resource use in protection of the core and buffer zones. And a sentence that I really like to visualize the core area is it's a dynamic, ever-expanding cooperation zone where the work of the Biosphere Reserve is applied to the needs of the local people. And I think when you read that article I've assigned to you on Biosphere Reserves, it will give you a case study where these kinds of concepts are taking place. But biosphere reserves are very different from national parks. National parks, historically in the United States, were chosen for spectacular scenery. The United States had the first national park in the world was Yellowstone. And the idea in North America and in the United States was we didn't have monuments like Europe had, big cathedrals, but we had monuments of nature. And so national parks kind of represented monuments of nature that could compete with the monuments in Europe. And biosphere reserves are representative samples of the world's ecosystems. So they're not necessarily spectacular in terms of scenery. In terms of national parks, no park in the US was chosen to protect fauna. In fact, the bison were wiped out of Yellowstone National Park, whereas in biosphere reserves, protection of biodiversity is a major goal. National parks are, in a way, islands of natural areas surrounded by human-dominated landscapes. And the original idea is you had this virgin landscape uninhabited by humans, when in fact you used to have indigenous people like the Shoshone in Yellowstone, which were kicked out of the park as soon as the park was created. Where biosphere reserves integrate human development, they're designed to integrate biodiversity conservation and economic development. And so reduce the conflict between humans and nature.